Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Mary Holt, current president of the Historical Society. Welcome and thank you for joining us in person or on Zoom for the Historical Society's Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture Series, established by Cap Leonard. The Board of Trustees offers sincere thanks to Cap for his continued generous support of the lecture series. Sincere thanks also to the Shebig Community Church for making their lovely space available to us. Also worthy of great appreciation are our technology crew members, Richard Hackle, technology lead, and John Holt, ever present for everything assistant. You must be getting tired of that. Before commencing with the lecture, I wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people who were first to inhabit Shebig, forage its fields and forests, and fish its waters. You will find in the back of the church, or just on the other side of the door, a donation jar if you wish to support the efforts of the Historical Society. Please save your questions relative to the lecture. They will be addressed following the lecture. Those zooming in are asked to type their lecture questions in the chat box and select "to everyone." Tonight's lecture, Vladimir Putin, Why is he misunderstood?, will be delivered by Nick Wessell. Nick studied under President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, at Columbia's Russian Institute and researched the Soviet press at Moscow State University. Nick served as director of research office at the United States Information Agency and conducted the first government polls of Russian public opinion during the Reagan administration. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you to our technologists. Richard alone has taught me more about operating a MacBook Pro
I'm not so sure about that.
in 1 hour than I've learned in 10 years.
Back out, sorry. Nothing's working at all now. Huh. Come on. Nope, that's not it. I wish it was. Got it. I don't know how to get rid of the got it. I don't see the got it. It won't go away. Weird. Well. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to. I have no access to this laptop. Sorry, everyone. Maybe.
That's a good point. I don't know. Kick it.
Is this an issue with Zoom or with the slides?
It's not your slide.
We don't know what we're doing here. It's right here. What, you don't have the mouse?
That's John.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't want to escape. Oh, there it goes. Now,
The award.
there we go. You did it. John's touch.
So now you gotta
Go to the start.
and back up, there you go. And through that.
Books.
There. Okay.
Well, thank you. We'll try to start again. And I hope that this doesn't blast out the people in the first row, but that those in back can hear. Yes. First, let me thank you, Mary, for that kind introduction and for our technological experts here. And in particular, let me thank the Historical Society for inviting me in this illustrious series. And I guess I can only blame Cap Leonard for having twisted my arm to give this talk. He has been most supportive, as they say, and I appreciate that. It's very kind of the church also to provide us with such a lovely setting, as I hope we'll see, if we have enough time, the role of religion in Vladimir Putin's presidential tenure and career, if not in his life, has been very important. Winston Churchill once said, although before I go to Churchill, a special word I think about Ellsworth Miller.
I don't
after
know.
whom this lecture series is named. He braved Nazi U-boats, as we know, across the North Atlantic to Murmansk at the very moment of probably the peak of Russian-American relations in the history of the two countries. And I think that it's particularly appropriate that I'm able to give this talk, even though it's at the low point, very nearly, in Russian-American relations. Explaining Vladimir Putin is the title of what I'm going to have to say. Does everyone misunderstand him? And that's a big subject, particularly if you stop to think that we're talking about not just Putin the man, but also we're really talking at this point about a war in Ukraine. And so you have a deep history in addition to the geopolitical realities of today and Putin's psychology, and they're all mixed together. I probably won't do complete justice to any of those three pillars of the subject, but I'll do what I can. Winston Churchill, as I was going to say a moment ago, once described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. What is not so well known is what he then said. The key, he said, is perhaps Russian national interest. And I will take off from that observation by adding that not only Russian national interest, but who defines Russian national interest and how and what do you do about it? I will now begin what is going to be a mix of slides and talk, and we will see how that works out. And the answer at the moment is that it is not working out. And so I may simply dispense with the slides, although there's some great graphics in here. I'm sorry that you all missed what was going to be the highlight of the talk, which was the very start of it before I began talking. And it is a video, a 2 or 3 minute video of Vladimir Putin singing Blueberry Hill. How many people saw that when it first appeared a decade ago? One. A remarkable rendition. I'm not a musician, so in fact, I'm tone deaf. So I really shouldn't comment, but I can tell you what my reaction nevertheless was. I found it impossible to say anything critical of Vladimir Putin for days afterwards, because I thought that he had done a terrific Fats Domino. Here we go. Political forecasting, that I'm about to do a little bit of it. We ought to acknowledge, as Dodge Morgan, glad to see Manny here this evening. Dodge Morgan once told me, political science is bullshit. And I had to agree with him because who wants to disagree with Dodge? But it is also something that we can't do without. Witness the fact that we have politicians and they're practicing political scientists. The rest of us are academics. And we may or may not like politicians, but the fact is that they're the ones who are the leaders who make the most important historic decisions. And so now for a Vladimir Putin, not exactly psychoanalysis, but a brief trip through his life. Putin himself is a person who has deep roots in Russia. They would call him in Russia a mujik. A mujik in the 19th century was a peasant. A mujik today is salt of the earth, real man of the people. And his forebears testify to that. Here is his grandfather. Putin's grandfather was a cook for Lenin and for Stalin. Putin's own father served in World War II, where he was gravely wounded. And after he was discharged from the Russian army because of his wounds in 1942, he went to work as a collective farmer. And those are indeed the modern day peasants of Russia. Putin's father was a man who was severe, but also fair. Putin, as a young man, as a student, looks, I think, well, I was going to say he looks anything but threatening, but actually there's something about him, isn't there, that is quite steely already in his visage. I'm a skeptic when it comes to people looking at paintings and photographs and saying, oh, you can look how he is feeling this now. And I rarely come to the same conclusion as the writer. But here I think you can see at least a young Putin with a developing sense of himself. Putin, as he grew older, really from the 7th grade on, he became a devotee of Sambo, a more violent form of judo, and then it was developed by the Soviet Army, and then of judo. And as he became older, he became more and more self-confident. And as he made friends, such as with Sasha Grigoriev here, he collected a retinue of people he could trust that he later appointed to high office. And indeed, you see here, Grigoriev runs, or was running at the time, the St. Petersburg, Leningrad office of the updated, renamed KGB, also known now as the FSB. Here is Putin at a little later stage in life with his black belt. And it is said of, as he has said of judo, that it teaches you patience, respect, and the ability to deal with stronger opponents successfully. At age 30, Putin marries an Aeroflot stewardess, Lyudmila, and with Lyudmila has 2 children. Here is the happy couple in Moscow following their wedding, or maybe St. Petersburg, can't tell. He sprang from virtually nowhere from Leningrad in 1991 to Moscow in 1999 as acting president. And here you see him with Boris Yeltsin, who is about to step down and appoint him as his successor as acting president in New Year's Eve 1999. Putin will then run for election as president in his own right in the spring of 2000. I would say that at this point, it is I who am having the problem here. A high point in Clinton's early career is his meeting with President Clinton when Putin himself is still just prime minister. And these photos have all been taken from his campaign autobiography called First Person, translated into English, widely distributed as a pre-campaign biography in advance of the presidential election in the spring of 2020. Here is about 25 years after he marries Vladimir and divorced her. He's divorced her just a few years earlier, and he has married Alina Kabayeva, a world-class gymnast who is reputedly the mother of two of his children. She lives in Switzerland and has now been sanctioned by the European Union and the United States. And then finally, I show you a pristine visage of a birch forest outside of Leningrad by Isaac Levitan from the 1880s as a suggestion of how in Putin's early years and career, things were relatively calm and very much to the satisfaction of both the Russians and the Americans. Although, as we'll see, quite a number of problems crop up. At this point, you may not be able to read that, but it says no more slides, please. So, okay, I'm going to cut them out for the moment and talk to you a little bit from my notes. I think we usually have how much time devoted to this lecture and Q&A? An hour and 15. So I'm certainly not going to, I will simply break off after 45 minutes, maybe less, if I get that far. I want to focus for a moment on a day that will live in infamy. Not Pearl Harbor, but a day that will live in infamy for Vladimir Putin. And it's December 5th, 1989. The Berlin Wall has fallen. There's an angry crowd of East Germans surrounding secret police headquarters in Dresden, East Germany. Putin is there as a KGB agent, having gone through training in the Soviet Union. He is there and he writes in his recollection, these people, the East Germans, were in an aggressive mood. I called our group of forces because he's in the same building as the East German Stasi, the East German secret police, and the East Germans are angry at the regime. These people were in an aggressive mood, he wrote. I called our group of forces and explained the situation. I was told, quote, we cannot do anything without orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. Said Putin, I got the feeling that the country no longer existed, that it had disappeared. It was clear that the Union was ailing, and it had a terminal disease without a cure. From the standpoint of his wife, Ludmila, who was with him in Dresden in 1989, and this is perhaps less analytic and more touching, I saw what happened to my neighbors, East Germans, many of them family of Stasi employees. When all those revolutionary events started in the GDR, my neighbor, who was my friend, cried for a week. She cried for her lost ideals, for the collapse of everything that she had believed in her whole life. For them, it was the collapse of everything, their lives, their careers, They were all left without jobs. There was a ban on their profession. Well, I would focus here on what she said, that they had lost everything, all their ideals. 2 years later, Mikhail Gorbachev's military advisor, General Akhramyev, would take his own life following the unsuccessful coup attempt to oust Gorbachev in 1991. He would leave a note saying, "I have lost everything that I have worked for." So that is a brief introduction to the subject of why Putin perhaps is the Russian nationalist that he is. Remember now that he has been brought from Leningrad after a 10-year stint there, almost 8 years, to Moscow. This was after a period of desperate chaos in Russia. Do some of you remember the 1990s in Russia from either visiting or reading or watching CNN? It was a pathetic existence. After generations under Soviet rule of living with fixed prices, full employment, and cradle to grave security at a price, they now confronted your average Russians, your mujiks, now confront shock therapy, which was the pell-mell privatization of the state's enormous natural resources and other assets. It was the time of full-scale inflation, much like Germany after World War I, where you recall the wheelbarrows of Deutschmarks being taken to the grocery store to buy a loaf of bread. There was in every park in Moscow and Leningrad, there was a huge array of people, usually elderly retired pensioners, who had their family heirlooms and trinkets and anything of conceivable value out there to be purchased by whoever might provide them with a few kopecks or a ruble. In this terrible situation, Boris Yeltsin had to run for re-election in 1996, after you remember his taking the helm from Gorbachev in the course of 1991. Yeltsin had a 3% approval rating. That's 1, 2, 3. Worse than Donald Trump or Joe Biden. He confronted a red-brown alliance in the State Duma. They'd had some free elections. Red because communist, brown because neo-fascist. This was a desperate situation for Yeltsin and the cause of democracy, some of us thought. Yeltsin clearly did, since his job was at stake. And so, with no money, no campaign, and no prospects, Yeltsin does the one thing that he can do, and that is he sells off the natural resources of the country to the so-called Russian oligarchs, a mafioso operation if there ever was one. In return for these shares, this ownership of their natural resources, they contribute loans to him so that he can finance what turns out to be a surprising and successful re-election effort. This was a period, though, when Putin in Leningrad has been dealing with businessmen there also, and has got himself caught up in similar transactions that were dubious, at least from the standpoint of the businessmen, in order to bring food into Leningrad. He made compromises with the businessmen, and then when his boss, the mayor of St. Petersburg then, Anatoly Sobchak, ran for mayor, Putin went to these businessmen that he had benefited and said, please kick in money and make sure that our man can get reelected. They turned him down. This is the beginning of Putin's understanding of how to treat Russian businessmen. You have to get the goods on them, or else they won't return the favor. And so he uses his position as, in effect, head of the tax administration in St. Petersburg to learn who is evading taxes and who is not. And he learns that this is a source of leverage. He brings that knowledge with him to Moscow when Yeltsin brings him to Moscow, and he begins to do the same thing with the businessmen and the oligarchs in Moscow. And as you know from that probably well-told story, he ends up basically telling the oligarchs, if you stay out of politics, I won't go after you for taxes. And it worked. This is a period also when Russia could be characterized as Nigeria without missiles. Well, if you're a Russian, any comparison to an African country is the greatest and most offensive insult that you can imagine. And to be called Nigeria or Upper Volta with missiles is to dismiss you in the worst terms, including the worst ethnic terms from the standpoint of what are sometimes very, shall we say, earthy Russian perspectives on race. So the fear is that Russia is going to fall apart the same way the Soviet Union did and the Warsaw Pact. Why? Because in a number of ethnic minority communities in the country, including most prominently Chechnya, there are demands for sovereignty, and the Chechens actually declare independence. So it seems that as if the country may be falling apart. Putin notices this and, of course, is alarmed. Not that at this point he has any power to do much about it. Also at this time, it's clear that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is at risk because the Ukrainians in 1991 declared their independence of the Russian Federation and are an independent state. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet is headquartered in Sevastopol only because in 1997, a sovereign Ukrainian government and Yeltsin reach agreement for a long-term lease for the Russian Navy at Sevastopol. And so that's the basis on which the Russian Navy is currently in the Crimea, the country of Ukraine. But as far as Moscow is concerned, they've annexed it. No one else recognizes that annexation. Putin also realizes, as a result of various experiences, particularly the one in East Germany, how easily the ruling elite may be overthrown by an aroused populace. And this will have important implications for him going forward. Now, when he comes into power, in the surprise move by Boris Yeltsin to appoint him, he's just been prime minister on Yeltsin's appointment for 6 months or less. Yeltsin appoints him acting president, vacates office New Year's Eve 1999, and in comes Vladimir Putin, about whom most of us have heard almost nothing. And so we approach him with fresh eyes. There are a few expectations about him. Since Yeltsin appointed him, that's a big plus in his favor in Western eyes. And indeed, I have to admit that I figured Putin is probably going to be about as good as we can get. But then I was in Vladimir on a sabbatical in 2000, when in August of that year, the Kursk submarine sank. The nuclear-powered Soviet, ex-Soviet, now Russian submarine sank. You may recall some of that. 118 Russian sailors died. There was a 5-day waiting period before the Russian Navy or Putin did anything about it. What transpired was that Putin declined the assistance of the Norwegian Navy with their deep dive submersibles to try and save the crew. Whether they could have been saved or not is not clear in retrospect, But what stood out in everyone's mind at that time, and to me, watching on television, because Russian TV covered it in detail, was that basically Putin had made a decision not to allow a NATO member country to try and save his sailors on that submarine, because he feared that those Norwegians, the deep dive people, might come away with secrets of Russian nuclear naval technology. That told me, and I think it told a lot of other people at the time, this is all we need to know about Vladimir Putin. We understand his priorities now. Joe Biden, many years later, actually, Joe Biden said not so long after that, that he had met Putin and told Putin, "You have no soul." And Putin said to him, "Now we understand each other." So what went wrong? Everything. Who lost Russia? Everybody. Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Hillary Clinton, Trump, Biden. But above all, Putin lost Russia for us. And I'll segue right away to one of my major thoughts on the subject, and that is that Putin lost Russia because he is a product of Russian culture, Russian values, Russian preoccupations with nation, with ethnicity, with great power politics. Whereas American leaders, rightly or wrongly, in decades since Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were in power, the United States has placed much heavier emphasis on human rights, international law, and so-called universal values. This approach to international affairs is often in direct conflict with a realist approach to international affairs, which I would argue that Putin in no small measure represents. If you look at Putin's grievances against the United States, and I'm going to have to run right through them because there are so many, and they are so deep. But he has felt that the United States slighted Russia and demeaned the country, not only since he came into power, but in the last Yeltsin years as well. Putin once said, "We were weak, and the weak are beaten." His number one complaint, of course, has been that NATO expanded into Soviet space. When the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the Warsaw Pact. That means Poland, Hungary, East Germany, of course, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania. I mean, imagine the falling dominoes. If ever there was a domino theory that worked out, it was in Eastern Europe. In return, he expected something and got nothing. In 1994, NATO established, in response to these Yeltsin's own sense that his own grievances against NATO expansion, because Putin did not originate that. Yeltsin's trouble with NATO's expansion wasn't that he saw NATO as a threat, but that the red-brown alliance of communists and neo-fascists challenging his authority would harp on NATO expansion and weaken him fatally. Nevertheless, or because of that, Yeltsin did express grievances to the United States about NATO expansion. In response, in 1994, under President Bill Clinton, no warmonger, I think, NATO created something called the Partnership for Peace. It was designed to include Russia and all the former Warsaw Pact nations in a larger expanded NATO. And indeed, in 1999, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic all joined NATO. 2 weeks later, alas, NATO bombed Serbia and forced Russian troops out of their position in Kosovo. You may recall some of that in the dim recesses of historical memory. But it was a moment when Putin had just arrived in Moscow. And this was probably an important element in his initial thinking about the United States. That we do a lot for the United States, and then what do? They turn around and bomb our fellow Slavs and allies in Serbia. And then they force the exiting of our troops from Kosovo. Putin's grievances, though, go far beyond NATO. And one might even suspect that the NATO grievances are perhaps exaggerated, if not manufactured. But he has a sense that everything we have done to promote human rights, democracy, the building of civil society in communist countries that had no independent civil service. Everyone served the party or the KGB or the Stasi. He felt that all of these efforts by the United States to promote universal human values were aimed at Russia and at him in power. And he definitely feared that the Rose Revolution in Georgia that brought a pro-NATO leader into power in 2003, that street protests in Kiev in 2004, the Orange Revolution that brought in a pro-Western government. Still another Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014 that caused the pro-Russian and elected president of Ukraine to flee to Moscow because of popular animosity. All of these for Putin. Well, let me quote Putin, because there's no better source on Putin than Putin. He said, "The West wants to tear off from us the juiciest piece possible." That is the thinking, of course, of someone who misses the Soviet Union, indeed the Tsarist Empire. Let's see if we can now do some slides. While we are hoping for slides to return, let me continue with some more Putin in his own words, because the man is very intelligent. He fancies himself quite an historian. Compared to most politicians, he is. He's a very manipulative historian, however, and yet there is always a kernel of insight in what he says. Here's a complaint he made in 2008 when he's attending a NATO meeting in Bucharest, Romania, because he's a partner for peace with NATO. That's not the same thing as being a member of NATO. If you're a member of NATO, you're in a defensive alliance when an attack on one is an attack on all. If you're a partner in the Partnership for Peace, you're a friend. Here's what Putin said in 2008 at this NATO meeting. "I heard today that this expansion of NATO is not against Russia. Bismarck was an important German and European political leader. He said that in such matters, what is important is not the intention, but the capability. We have withdrawn our troops deployed in Eastern Europe and withdrawn almost all large and heavy weapons from the European part of Russia. And what happened? A NATO base in Romania, where we are now. One in Bulgaria. An American missile defense area in Poland and the Czech Republic. That all means moving military infrastructure to our borders. So this is Putin's mindset, not unreasonable by and large. And he confronts a situation that is, as he sees it, very unfavorable. But maybe there's hope after all. Trump is running for president. Let's help him in 2016. Biden bugs out of Afghanistan where we'd had no casualties in 18 months. And so he concludes the United States will not intervene militarily in a distant country. Meanwhile, Europe, but particularly Germany, is dependent on Russian oil for their factories and on Russian natural gas for heating to keep them from freezing in the winter. And as we approach fall and the winter, there's a very real danger that there will be Europeans, particularly Germans, without heat all winter. So the question is, why did Putin invade Ukraine? And here, if we can go to a slide, we'll have a map of Ukraine and some other things.
The computer's going to sleep, so you have to wake it up by signing back in.
Oh, okay, like so.
And now, give it another.
Does it take longer to wake up? Anyone else out there awake? The answer, if I can continue, is that it was a brilliant move on Putin's part. Lesson for Putin. I am a contrarian, but I'm not for Putin. I am trying to get inside man's mind to see what it is his calculations are. He made a brilliant move on February 24th when he sent troops to Kiev. He had in mind, I think, the Christmas Eve invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when the Soviet Bureau sent their special forces into Kabul, deposed the government, and successfully took over the capital. And as we know, for 10 years, wasted their resources, not that we learned anything, wasted their resources trying to pacify the country. And so what Putin had in mind was a blitzkrieg that would decapitate the Ukrainian government. And did everyone follow that probably in the early days? In which you had two lines coming down, two spearheads, if you will, on either side of the Dnieper River, planning to close in on Kiev from east and west. And it would have worked if only the Ukrainians had not successfully defended the Hostomel airport, which needed to be seized by Russian special forces if they were going to bring in enough force to immediately seize Zelensky. And so that was a absolutely decisive moment in which Putin's decisive stroke turned out to be stupid. But as Dodge Morgan says, political science is bullshit. And even the practitioners, the very most capable practitioners, are wrong about 40% of the time, right? And this was a major miscalculation on Putin's part. Here is Ukraine. Everyone is probably familiar with it. It doesn't stand out too well on this map, but you can see that it is the, what color would you call it? Pale yellow. At the same time that these two pincer movements come down on Kiev, and you can see they got really quite close to downtown Kiev and the presidential office. At the same time, though, the Russian army also undertook military action. Oh, did I call it a war? They spent the special military operation also involved sending the Russian army into the Donbass. Those are the red arrows you see. That's the industrial heartland of Ukraine. At the same time, and that's where, 30% of the Soviet Union's defense industry was located. At the same time, from the Crimea, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is headquartered, about 60 ships, Russian troops moved north out of the Crimea to Melitopol, Kherson, and briefly threatened Odessa. I'll leave this map up for a moment. Well, I see that I've spoken for, well, I guess we had a few minutes delay at the beginning, didn't we? So maybe I'll go a little bit longer, but then not too much longer. The Russian losses, as we know, have been huge. Their size is probably anyone's guess. But this morning I read a Russian blogger who reported based on a memo from the Defense Ministry to the Ministry of Finance that said to the Ministry of Finance, please set aside enough money so that we can pay the families of 50,000 soldiers we have lost their pensions. The Russians probably have lost 2,000 tanks. They've probably lost 4,000 armored combat vehicles. It's been a disaster. And they've lost, of course, many, many generals. Well, what does Putin say about this? Earlier, in first person, back from the year 2000, he made this observation. I think there are always a lot of mistakes made in war. That's inevitable. But when you are fighting, if you keep thinking that everyone around you is always making mistakes, you'll never win. You have to take a pragmatic attitude, and you have to keep thinking of victory. Also in that campaign autobiography in 2000, he told the story about the first time he ever got beat up. And he said he learned several lessons, one of which was you need to assume that there's no retreat and you'll have to fight to the end. Ukraine, of course, has lost a lot of men and material also. The fog of war being what it is, Ukrainian numbers may be only a little better than the Russian numbers, but the Ukrainians claim 9,000 soldiers dead, 5,000 civilians. To quote Winston Churchill again, though, all of these numbers have to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. Churchill in World War II said at the height of the Battle of Britain, truth is so important that it must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And so we'll take the numbers for what they're worth. Well, in a long war, Russia has 1 million active duty troops. Ukraine, a couple 100,000. The Russians have 10,000 tanks, or did. The Ukrainians, 6,500, or did. Russia's gross domestic product is $1.8 trillion. Ukraine's is 200 billion. But Napoleon said, in war, morale with the number of soldiers as 3 is to 1. And of course, what the Ukrainians have proven is how correct Napoleon was. I'll leave this up for the moment, even though it's not particularly relevant. Well, it's relevant, but it's off subject slightly. Vladimir Putin is a KGB agent. That means the most important thing, as his boss Yuri Andropov once put it, is working with people. Working with people means getting the tax information on tax evaders in order to win the cooperation of oligarchs. It also means that when you first meet, or on one of the very first meetings, with a foreign head of state, in this case, Germany's Angela Merkel, you get briefed on the fact that she has a terrible fear of dogs. She was bitten by one in 1995. So in Sochi, when Putin receives her on a state visit, he introduces her to Tony, his big black lab, who spends his time sniffing around her and finally lies down right in front of her. As Fiona Hill points out, a classic KGB tactic. Maybe I will stop right there, not get into Putin's justification for the war, see if people's questions maybe get into some of these issues. If you have any questions, this is probably as good a time as any to get me to stop talking. Yes. Political science is bullshit. You could have asked Nikita Khrushchev the same thing in the summer of 1964. You could ask Donald Trump today. I would think his hold on power is very considerable. I say this, though, having said all through the 1970s and 1980s that we will never see the Communist Party of the Soviet Union overthrown. I'd spent enough time there talking to enough Russians and enough mujiks that I had a very firm grasp of the fact that this police state had instilled a degree of fear that would last for at least 20 years and probably my lifetime. However, I should point out a couple of interesting developments just today, if you want to hang your hat on something optimistic. Some of you may have seen the report that 18 city councilors from Leningrad, Moscow, and another city have signed a declaration to Putin that he should resign. That takes courage. Being a foreigner in the Soviet Union didn't take any courage. I knew that if I was arrested, I'd be detained, and then the embassy would come get me after 48 hours of interrogation and get me on the first plane home. But my Russian friends were at risk. And these Russians, of course, are at risk. Another report this morning was that Putin had decided to postpone his meeting with his armed forces chiefs of staff for unexplained reasons. Make of that what you want to, probably not much at this point. So I think his hold on power is, it's like the stock market. When JP Morgan was asked what the stock market would do, what his forecast was, he said, it will fluctuate. Yes. Will Putin institute a draft? I would think not. That's a very good way to get all those mujiks into the army where they're going to be exposed to Ukrainian fire. And one thing that's come out very clearly in this military operation, special as it is that the Russian soldiers are demoralized. And this includes the best of their soldiers, not draftees who might be sent into combat after 2 weeks of training. So I would think he would not institute a draft. It hits too close to home. Yes.
Yeah, in your current readings, indicate where his health may be failing. I know that's a sound of optimism in some way. And if so, if let's say that he got very sick, he could no longer rule, does he handpick somebody to take his place along the way?
He has not handpicked anyone, quite wisely. I don't think there's any sign that he is in anything but vigorous health. We've seen him, of course, riding horseback, bare-chested. We've seen him bare-chested get baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, or rebaptized just 4 years ago. We know that we're told that he exercises 20 or 30 minutes at the start of every day and at the end, and that he still does judo. My guess is he could flip even a large target like Donald Trump. You asked, though, not just about his health, but
Well, my second one, you already said it. Does he have somebody lined up to take his place?
he was no one lined up. There is someone in jail who would be an excellent successor. Alexei Navalny. Much more likely is that I think some discontented generals would turn on him, and we would get a general replacing him. The generals have to be fit to be tied. Their forces are being chewed up, all in a cause in which they may not have been as enthusiastic as Putin himself. Did any of you see the video of, and the Russian television makes it readily available, you can go on YouTube and find it, in which he dresses down, no, I'm sorry, this is the one that doesn't get broadcast, but it was live at the time. Putin dresses down his intelligence chief for foreign affairs for not answering directly that he supports the independent sovereignty of the Donbass republics. And the poor guy just couldn't get it straight. And Putin humiliated him. There may be others who've been similarly humiliated, but I wouldn't count on it. Barry?
It's going to be my question, because it seems that when these dictators or autocrats fall, it's very often the military that has the cohesion and the power to bring it about. But this crushing morale problem in the Russian military, there got to be competent people there who are very upset about that, and who I think that is a likely area that if this continues, with Russian soldiers throwing away their rifles and so on, it might be quite likely that the military will move against them.
The problem is that the military has proven itself incompetent. That is certainly Putin's judgment, even though he has not said so publicly, of course. But if you read or listen to any of the retired American generals on CNN or any of the other networks, probably NPR, PBS, if you read the Washington Post and the New York Times interviews with them, to a man, generals like Wesley Clark say that this war has exposed the incompetence of the Russian military. And so he wants to fire them, and they may want to fire him, and so they may just agree to get along for a while. Yes.
Can you speak a bit about his relationship to the church or the influence of the church?
Putin has made a big show of the fact that he's a Russian Orthodox believer, and it takes whatever opportunity he can to demonstrate it. And so he has made common cause with the Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, who has blessed the troops. Putin makes every effort to associate himself with Russian Orthodoxy. And leads certainly one to remember the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Soviet times, where probably half of the hierarchy was KGB or agents. The Russian Orthodox Church wants Ukraine. Why? Because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has separated from the Russian Orthodox Church and is now independent. And if you want to get back all that real estate, all those churches, including the Uniate churches in Western Ukraine that recognize the Pope's authority, then you want to do whatever you can to extend the boundaries of the Russian Federation, because at the same time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will once again be resubordinated to the patriarch. Yes.
A lot of speculation. Respect to who Putin listens to. Do the oligarchs have any influence over him, and more importantly, does China have any influence over him?
I don't think that China or the oligarchs have any influence to speak of on Putin. He has successfully sidelined the oligarchs. They never were an oligarchy in the classic sense of a small group of people ruling. They were always just a bunch of businessmen who, with guns and other not always legal means, took control of different sectors of the economy. They have fought among themselves. The most powerful ones are dead from suicide. Boris Berezovsky in London, maybe a suicide, maybe not. They're jailed in Siberia, Alexei Navalny, who was not an oligarch, but there are a couple of oligarchs who have spoken out, saying that they are for peace. Well, that's not too controversial. Everyone's for peace. Now, the question is on what condition. So I don't think the oligarchs have any leverage on him. China would have leverage on him if they chose to supply him with the computer chips he is desperately short of. He needs those chips. The president of China has to date apparently refused to give any military hardware to the Kremlin. Were that to change, then Xi would have some leverage on him. Peter.
I mean, Russia is a big place, and there seems to be there's a lot happening outside of Moscow. So, democratization, people running for office, city councils, things like that. I mean, is that happening outside? Is something happening outside of Moscow with the need to a change eventually?
Well, we've had some pretty dramatic change, haven't we? Here we are in 2022. The Soviet Union collapsed now more than 30 years ago. And what are we talking about? We're talking about some independently elected municipal representatives signing a declaration calling on the president of the country to resign. Putin, so long as he can control television and doesn't have to run for a fair, free election, can allow a certain amount of this stuff to happen in the localities. But power in Russia has always been determined by what happens in Moscow. Prior to 1917, St. Petersburg. So I think that these examples of grassroots activism are very hopeful for the future. They show the way in which many Russians have changed their mentality, but I don't think it's going to result in a revolution that ousts Putin. Yes.
If Putin does go, do you think he's more likely to be replaced by someone just like him, or someone more along the lines of Gorbachev? Or there could be some significant change?
Well, that's a real hard question to answer. I think that what is most likely is that the military would take over, that without Putin's personal investment in this special military operation, they will have an incentive to reduce their own casualties and the destruction of their tank armies. They will have an incentive to sue for peace. They'll have an incentive to, well, if we can go backwards, Guess not. They'll have an incentive to negotiate. Probably while keeping some of their troops in the Donbass to see if they can't get some of the Donbass in a negotiated settlement. And I think they're almost certain to resist most fiercely the return of the Crimea to Ukraine because of the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet being there. But it's guesswork. Did someone have a hand up in back? Barry.
Is Putin saying not to get that African weapons?
Political science is bullshit. I don't know. I think, first of all, he is saying he is the ultimate rational actor. This is a guy who is very intelligent, who is not given to incautious statements, is highly analytic. Would he go nuclear? If things got bad enough, which I read as if his hold on the Kremlin was threatened by foreign forces, that is to say, NATO were converging on Moscow, then yes, I think he would probably trot out. The Russians have 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. We have 150 or 200. And these are very small kilotonnage, 1 or 2 kiloton weapons, many of them. So they're very useful for selective military operation. And he's got a lot of them. It's the only force he has where he really enjoys an advantage. Were he to do that, of course, for reasons less than his own skin being at stake as NATO forces advanced on Moscow, in this highly unlikely hypothetical, I think the United States would then be faced with really a very difficult choice. One, of course, would be to reply with our own tactical nuclear weapons. One would be to have a demonstration, strike and drop one somewhere in the Black Sea so he could see that maybe they're serious, but not so serious as actually to drop one on me. More likely, I think, is that you would get a concerted American, NATO, conventional military response in behalf of the Ukrainian army. And so I think he knows that. He could then lose the Crimea and territory in the Don Basin. And so I think he's quite disincentivized. And of course, at the strategic nuclear level, each country has about 1,550 warheads and is limited to 700 delivery vehicles. So it's a pretty equal balance, if you will, numerically. And no one wants to, I think, go to that level. But of course, you lose control in a war. Yes. Yes. I say that because I want to be incisive. They haven't gotten Putin to do anything different from what he's already done militarily. And they're not going to. Not between now and this winter. I'm sure he's going to see how much the Germans can take, how much the French can take, now that he's cut off their natural gas and their oil, most of their oil. And so I think he's probably going to want to see for several months how this works out. Long term, he has really screwed the country over. I mean, there are probably 300,000 Russian professionals in IT, in technologies of various sorts, journalists, perhaps even some defense consultants. 300,000 Russians have fled the country since February 24th. This is the cream of the crop. And they have left for a reason. They know they're not going back. They know that this war is a signal for an abrupt change in Russia that will last as long as Putin is in power. So there's long-term damage that's being sustained. I wanted to make a brief reference to Putin's justification for going into the country. He thinks it's one country. He wrote, or had his name attached to, a long analysis, historical analysis last July, a year ago July, 14 months ago, in which he insists that Ukraine is one country with Russia. There is no difference. We're Russian Orthodox. We speak the same or virtually the same language. We have a shared historical experience. Our economies in the old Soviet days were absolutely embedded with each other. Here you have a couple of themes that come together. On top, you see what is a Ukrainian 1,000 hryvnia note. Hryvnia, I think is how they pronounce it. I don't know Ukrainian. And that shows Prince Vladimir, who adopted Christianity for Russia, Kiev Rus, in 988. And so he is a hero to the Ukrainians because he brought in Christianity to us, and he did it in Kiev, our capital. Below is a 1,000 ruble note that is Russian. It shows Prince Vladimir also. Why? Because, oh, and you can see that Prince Vladimir has a Russian traditional Orthodox beard, whereas we have a Cossack mustache, a Ukrainian Cossack mustache on Vladimir in the hryvnia. So what we have here is dueling currencies, but also dueling claims on the religion and on Kiev, on the country, on the culture. And I think, that's going to be a hard one to resolve. Are there any other questions? If not, let me say thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In one of the photographs you had with Clinton and Putin, with Clinton and Putin, you had, it looked to me as if Putin is very small. Is that true?
Yes, Putin is short in stature. He's turned that to his advantage, however, by virtue of the fact that he has a personality that is outsized.
I just wondered if that was something to do with that.
I don't think he's,
He's not Napoleonic.
well, I mean, was Napoleon Napoleonic? We think, of course, of Napoleon as having this fixation on his shortness. I doubt that's the case with Putin. He's quite self-confident, but that self-confidence comes from judo and his learning how to deal with larger opponents effectively. Yes.
How much of the real story is getting for, sources of information?
Not much. There's some getting through to those who are more technically conversant. Certainly the mujiks in the countryside aren't getting anything. Those who attend social media get some, but all the Western social media have been blocked. And Putin has substituted his own Russian social media instead. So, yes, Barry.
Cutting off or I mean, you're not getting your mark. Not getting, I mean, that's why Russia's economy survives, because of its oil and gas that it can sell. I mean, so they're not going to sell it. Isn't that also going to crush? I mean, it seems to me a short-sighted move.
Well, long term, you may be right. But the fact is that You can get by on reduced revenue, particularly with the price of oil so high as it is, and natural gas. You can get by on, a 30% decline in the revenue and outlast the people who are freezing in their apartments in Western Europe. Let me just share with you a factoid. Ukrainians voted for in a referendum on independence on December 1st, 1991, as the Soviet Union was breaking up. 84% turned out to vote. When have we had 84% turn out in an American election, even when the stakes are high? Never. 92% of Ukrainians voted for independence. And they have shown, I think, since February 24th and the invasion of Ukraine, that they do see themselves as an independent country and not one people with the Russians. To finish on a note of realism, if you will, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of my professors, wrote many years ago now, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Russia can be either an empire or a democracy, but it can't be both. Thank you. My apologies, I went a little long.
Thank you, Nick, very much. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you on Zoom for joining us. Just want to remind you that on Monday, October 10th, 7 p.m. right here at the church, Bill Danielson, Professor Emeritus, University of Hartford, will be lecturing on Shebig weather, past, present, and future. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. We look forward to Bill. And thank you all very much. Good night.